So, Chris Schüler is a freelance writer, journalist, and cultural historian specializing in European fiction and translation, travel, and the arts. His most recent book, Along the Amber Route, St. Petersburg to Venice, is an epic travelogue through Eastern and Central Europe. Tonight, Chris will read extracts from his forthcoming book, The Wood That Built London. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Lucy. Uh, yes, it's ironic that having travelled 2,000 kilometres through Europe for my last book, I've now written about a place, part of which I can see from our back garden. The Wood That Built London is subtitled A Human History of the Great Northwood and will be published by Sandstone Press next October. I think the extracts I've chosen will, well, certainly the first of them comes from the introduction, so it will probably provide sufficient explanation. So I won't say any more, but we'll go straight in. Standing in the busy streets of South London today, it is hard to imagine that as recently as the 18th century, much of this suburban townscape was covered by an expanse of woodland and wooded commons, spreading almost unbroken for 7 miles from Croydon to the Thames at Deptford. Its legacy can be found in many local place names: Norwood, Collier's Wood, Honor Oak, Gypsy Hill, Penge, which means Wood's End, Woodside, Brockley, Badger's Wood, and Selhurst, from the Anglo-Saxon for dwelling in a wood. A survival of the wildwood that once covered much of Britain from Saxon times until the Industrial Revolution, the woods were intensively managed to provide timber for construction and shipbuilding, bark from which tannin was extracted for leather making, and charcoal to fire London's blacksmiths and bakeries. Its produce helped to build the city that would, in the course of a millennium, whittle it down to a few surviving remnants. The largest of these can be found at Dulwich and Sydenham Hill, where relict and secondary woodland still covers some 25 hectares. Smaller fragments can be found at One Tree Hill in Honor Oak, Bigginwood, Spa Hill, Beulah Heights and Grangewood Park in Norwood, and at Long Lane to the south of Elmer's End. The nearest ancient woodland to central London, they sustain wildlife in the capital, help cleanse its polluted air, and provide city dwellers with access not only to nature, but to something rooted deep in our collective unconscious. Woods are the setting for dark fairy tales such as Little Red Riding Hood, and resonate in literature, from Dante's Selva Oscura, a place of confusion and challenge, to Shakespeare's Forest of Arden, a sylvan refuge from the intrigue of the court. For much of its history, this tract of woodland was known as Norwood, or the Northwood, on account of its position in relation to Croydon, the manor to which much of it belonged. It is nowadays referred to as the Great Northwood, but this appears to be a Victorian invention. I found no record of it earlier than 1863 in the proceedings of the Surrey Archaeological Society, and there the great has a lowercase g, indicating a prenomial adjective rather than a part of the name itself. By 1898, when the Croydon historian John Corbett Anderson published his book The Great Northwood, the epithet had taken root. It is ironic that, like the river Effra that flowed from its slopes, the wood only acquired the name by which we know it today, when it was already fading into the past. What makes the surviving pockets of the Northwood so important, aside from their cultural resonance and amenity for local residents, is the fact that their antiquity is attested both by the presence of ancient woodland indicators, species such as wood anemone, only found in areas that have been continuously wooded for at least 400 years, and by extensive written records. Fortunately, the archives of the Archbishopric of Canterbury and the Dulwich Estate, which between them own much of the wood, still exist and preserve a record of its stewardship over more than 4 centuries. Other early evidence survives in the National Archives at Kew, including witness statements in disputes over the ownership of parts of the wood. In 1552, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer commissioned a survey of the utter bounds of the Manor of Croydon. The manuscript is now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, just a few hundred yards from the spot where that most reverend father in God, as the document describes him, was burned at the stake 3 years later. His surveyors, Leonard Pierrepoint and Thomas Taylor, together with certain ancient men of the Lordship of Croydon and also of divers parishes adjoining, made the circuit of the entire manor on the 3rd and 4th of May of that year. They started west of Croydon town by an elm tree that grew beside the mill at Wodden, on the border with the manor at Beddington. From here, they made their way clockwise around the manor boundary, following a hedge that zigzagged north and northeast between Thornton Heath, where they passed a pear tree which, in early May, was probably still clothed in white blossom, and Norbury. At the corner of a field called Rycroft, they turned southeast along Streatham Lane and followed it into the Northwood, where they came to a small hill marked with a round hole. Here, it seemed, the surfaced road petered out, for the surveyors advised their readers to follow the most used way for 3/4 of a mile to High Cross, presumably a boundary tree. If the survey is correct, this would have stood on what is now Central Hill, near the junction with Hermitage Road. From High Cross, they proceeded another half-mile to the Vicar's Oak. This important boundary tree marked the point where the parishes of Lambeth, Camberwell, Croydon and Battersea met on Norwood Hill. The site, at what is now the crossroads of Crystal Palace Parade, Westow Hill, Church Road and Annerley Hill, is marked by a plaque beside the gates of Crystal Palace Park. This immense oak could be seen from 10 or 12 miles away, and even, according to one observer, from Harrow on the Hill, 17 miles northwest on the far side of London. At the Vicar's Oak, the party turned south along the highway running between Croydon and Penge to the foot of Gravel Hill Way, where an oak grew in an elder bush, and from there they headed west without any common path or beaten way for about 200 yards to another large oak marked with a cross which grew on the bank of a boundary ditch known as the Bishop's Ditch. They then followed the ditch to the place where, yet in men's remembrance, another great oak called Dead Man's Oak had stood until it was felled. From here they continued south to Penge Corner and along the ditch that marked the boundary between Kent and Surrey. Passing Ham Farm, near Long Lane Wood, on their right, they began to bear southwest to complete the circuit back to their starting point at Wodden Mill. Now, I'm going to leap forward 3 centuries. Then the Crystal Palace came, recalled John Ruskin. After the closure of the Great Exhibition of 1851, Joseph Paxton's huge glass and iron greenhouse was dismantled and moved from Hyde Park to Penge Place, where it was reconstructed and enlarged between 1852 and 1854. The traveller passing along the Brighton Railway, noted the Observer in June 1853, would have seen enormous mounds of earthwork and bricks heaped up along the base of the hill, a vast extent of sandy-looking soil, denuded of trees or verdure, and towering above like the skeleton remains of some huge antediluvian monster, the gigantic ribs and framework of the building. The palace was opened by Queen Victoria on the 10th of June 1852, and 2 water towers, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, were added the following year to feed the many fountains in its grounds. Standing 280 feet tall, almost half the height of the present Crystal Palace transmitter, they were clearly visible across much of South London. Ruskin was characteristically disparaging, describing the structure as possessing no more sublimity than a cucumber frame between 2 chimneys, and complaining that its stupidity of hollow bulk dwarfs the hills at once, so that now one thinks of them no more but as 3 long lumps of clay on lease for building. The palace changed the area dramatically, forever spoiling the view, Ruskin fumed, and bringing every show day from London a flood of pedestrians down the footpath who left it filthy with cigar ashes for the rest of the week. Then the railroads came, and expatiating roughs by every excursion train, who knocked the palings about, roared at the cows, and tore down what branches of blossom they could reach. Straddling the Kent-Surrey border, The structure itself covered 18 acres and was set in 200 acres of terraced and landscape park that completely altered the topography, obliterating Old Copple Lane, Isabel Hill, the Shire Ditch, and what was left of Penge Common. This presented a challenge for the parishioners of Camberwell, who still beat the bounds in the traditional manner. On Ascension Day in May 1874, the vicar, constable, beadle, gorgeous in the red and gold of ancient Bumbledom, and vestryman, accompanied by a number of children, doggedly followed the boundary of their parish through the stately pleasure dome, brandishing willow wands. Entering en masse through the gate from the high-level station, reported a local newspaper, the company proceeded through the new dining room and thence through the intervening courts and elegant saloon, where the diners seemed somewhat astonished at their entrance. Afterwards, the company retired to the Greyhound in Dulwich, where ample justice was done to a very capital repast. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. I've got some comments here. From Laurel, a completely new way to see London's ancient roads and byways. Sue Hubbard, great. Sue Hubbard, I think, loves all the place names. James McDermott, it underlines how much wood as a medium is intrinsic to our history and to our future. Laurel, a lovely window on a different page. Tim Addes, fascinating. So lots of lovely comments coming through.
Oh, thank you all so much.
Anyone want to add anything? I enjoyed the journey from Richard C. Bauer. Lots of people want to add comments. So Susie Faye, you've unmuted yourself. You go first. Michael, prepare to unmute yourself.
Will it have maps?
Yes.
I immediately wanted to plot everything on a series of historical
I
maps.
spent an awful lot of time transcribing information from historical maps onto modern ones. Yes, we will definitely have at least one map, if not more. And I'm glad to say it will be illustrated. It'll have a bound-in section of colour illustrations and black and white illustrations in the text as well. So yes, I'm looking forward to having plenty of visual supporting material.
And your agent's on here, Tom Carl, and he has and still a vital asset for London. Michael, I've asked you to unmute so you can give your comment. Anyone else while Michael's waiting to unmute?
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Or how far northwest did the Great Wood go?
Well, it did include parts of
areas of woods.
Well, originally it was one wood. It gradually over the centuries got broken up as more and more got turned over. First, initially to agriculture and subsequently for building development. But I mean, basically it stretched, as I said, from Deptford in the northeast, stretched down certainly as far as Brixton and Streatham. And then from there, all the way down through Knights Hill to Croydon. And on the eastern side, it stretched all the way to Lewisham. In fact, parts of it, Sydenham Common, which wasn't dense woodland, but it was wooded common, was known as, just as the Northwood was known as such because it belonged to Croydon, that actually once belonged to the Priory of Lewisham, so it was known as the Westwood because it was west of Lewisham. And you'll still find Westwood is still a street name in the area.
Good, and we'll just finish with Michael because we're getting
just quickly, Chris. I wanted to ask: is the book a continuation of the excellent CD or disc that you produced 2 or 3 years ago?
It's an outgrowth from it. By the time pretty much by the time I'd finished doing that little film, I thought there's enough material here for a book, so I got working on it. Yes, it grew out of that project.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much, Chris. Great. We look forward
to it. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions.